already done an introduction, call me Josh. I know that these types of events don't lend themselves well to sort of questions and answers. No doubt you may have some questions. If you do, I'm going to be hanging around all day, so come find me, ask any questions you may have. So I've got the next 30 minutes or so, hopefully I can last 30 minutes, to go through a quick recap of what NSX is, conscious that maybe not everybody is familiar with what NSX is and how it works. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about why customers are actually deploying NSX, and what we see by far and large is that most organizations deploy NSX for security. Yes, it can do all these great things around automation and application continuity, but by far and large it is security. And then to Barry's point, actually what we're doing with NSX is broadening it far beyond just a hypervisor-based platform for the on-premise data center. The vision for NSX is to be a networking and security platform for heterogeneous endpoints, heterogeneous platforms. So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about what we actually mean by that. So, if the clicker works, perfect. So what is NSX? And we've already heard about the software-defined data center. So if you've been working with VMware technologies for any amount of time, you've probably heard us talk about this, and Joe referenced it earlier on, and as has Barry. NSX fundamentally is a component of the software-defined data center. We have vSAN from a storage virtualization perspective. We have vSphere for compute virtualization. And then we have NSX from a networking and a security virtualization perspective. And really there's three things that NSX drives from a use case perspective. We have this concept of security, we have automation, and we have application continuity. These are what I refer to as primary use cases. And within those use cases, we then have these sub-use cases. So from the perspective of security, NSX really revolves around this concept of micro-segmentation. And what we mean by micro-segmentation is that every virtual machine can become its own security boundary. Each virtual machine essentially has its own security policy, has its own firewall. So that's what we mean, micro-segmentation, this concept of very granularly segmenting networks. And we can apply this concept of micro-segmentation to different types of workloads. So we talk here about securing the end user. And what we're referring to here is our ability to integrate with technologies like Horizon. So as you bring virtual desktops into the data center, actually there's a lot of value in being able to micro-segment virtual desktops. We can apply this concept of micro-segmentation to the DMZ. So rather than having a physical DMZ with physical security controls on dedicated infrastructure, dedicated VLANs, actually we can bring that DMZ onto a shared platform, shared infrastructure, and then use micro-segmentation to segment between DMZ workloads and non-DMZ workloads. So that's security. We then have automation. So NSX, from a technology perspective, provides services like routing, switching, load balancing, firewalling. And those services can be provided in or consumed in a number of different ways. One is through a user interface, and in context of automation, the other way of consuming those is through an API. And when you start to consume these services through an API, you can do some really interesting things around streamlining the provisioning timescale. So I've got one particular customer that can now stand up development environments in 23 minutes versus 5.5 months before. So whilst most people look at security initially, there's a huge amount of value in automation. And it's important to highlight as well for application continuity that NSX isn't just a technology or a solution for a single data center or a single site. We can expand NSX across multiple data centers, multiple sites. And that can do some interesting things from a disaster recovery perspective. If I fail over a workload across sites with NSX, I don't need to worry about having to reconfigure those workloads, re-architect those workloads, replicate security policy across sites. NSX can present the same policies, can present the same networks to those workloads across sites. And then also that does some interesting things from a consumption perspective. I'm no longer bound by placing workloads in specific sites because that's where I can present specific networks. I have consistent networking across multiple sites. So as I said, we've got these three use cases, but by far and large, it's security is the driving factor behind NSX, why organizations are deploying NSX. And there's a few reasons why organizations use NSX as a security platform. So I've tried to pick out the points that I think compel customers to use NSX and really tried to distill them into 4 points. The first is around this concept with NSX that whilst we have this distributed firewall, we can configure and manage this security policy in NSX centrally. So I'm not managing security policy device by device. It's all managed centrally. We have this concept of a distributed firewall, each virtual machine getting its own firewall. So whilst we define policies centrally, actually where you enforce that policy is on a per virtual machine basis. And there's a bit of a misconception that getting NSX deployed is a big process, is a big project. And I want to talk a little bit about actually what it does take to get NSX deployed as a security platform. So I'm going to talk a little bit about rapid deployment. And then the fourth point why I think organizations look to use NSX is for integration. So whilst NSX can provide its own security capabilities, actually we have open APIs that a number of security vendors can integrate with. So we have integrations with the likes of Palo Alto, Checkpoint, Symantec, which do a number of different things for us. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes talking about each of these areas and giving you a bit more information on each of those points. So I'm going to start with centralizing security policy. So in NSX, you really define your security policy in 2 parts. You have the security policy itself, which contains 3 bits of information, really. The security policy contains what we refer to as guest introspection rules. Guest introspection is one of the ways in which we integrate third-party services. So we can integrate things like antivirus, anti-malware technologies into the NSX platform. And you define whether or not you want to include that integration in your guest introspection rule. So as part of a policy that I'd wrap around a virtual machine, I would say, you know, I want to scan that virtual machine to check that there's no virus on the endpoint itself. The second part of the security policy is the firewall rule itself. So the NSX firewall is what we refer to as a layer 4 firewall. So we're defining, at this point, our layer 4 security policy, or layer 4 firewall rules. So looking at port and protocol, essentially. And then the third part to that security policy is the second way in which we integrate with third-party vendors. That's what we call network introspection. So what we're doing with network introspection is integrating third-party services, things like IDS and IPS, or layer 7 firewall services. So using technologies from the likes of Palo Alto or Checkpoint. And we define all of this information centrally in NSX, so we can create these layers of security around each individual virtual machine. So once we've defined our security policy, which is really saying, how do I want to protect my workloads? The second part to that is then actually defining what is it that I want to protect. And we use something called a security group in NSX to define what it is that we actually want to protect. Now, this differs a little bit from the traditional security approaches where you use things like IP addresses and MAC addresses to define your source and your destination of policy. What we can do with NSX is by integrating with vCenter, is we can use all of that rich metadata in vCenter to define our security groups. So actually, rather than using IP addresses and MAC addresses, which don't necessarily translate to something meaningful to us, we can use things like application information. We could use a VApp template in vCenter. We could use folders or logical networks. We can use infrastructure information, or if you still want to do things the traditional way, we can still use IP addresses and MAC addresses, but actually I think one of the big values of NSX is changing how I define my policy. So I want to create application-specific security policies. So that's centralizing security policy. And I think really it's one of the big values that organizations see in NSX. And then we have this concept of distributed enforcement. So for a long period of time, the approach to security has been protecting the perimeter. I'm going to put the biggest, most feature-rich firewall I can at my data center perimeter and inspect traffic coming into and out of my data center. But actually, if you look at the, some of the big breaches that we've seen from an infrastructure perspective, attackers don't try to breach the perimeter. They look beyond the data center perimeter to find something within the data center that they can leverage. Once they have that foothold in the data center, they then look to exfiltrate and find information. So they move laterally within the data center and pull that information out of the data center over time. So what we're doing with NSX, with our distributed enforcement, is wrapping security policy and enforcement around every virtual machine. So shifting that focus from protecting the data center perimeter to, actually, I want to inspect and get visibility into all traffic within the data center, east-west, rather than just north-south. So as I said, each virtual machine can get its own security policy. We can define policy down to the VNIC. So if you have multiple virtual machines with multiple network interfaces, we can apply a different set of policy to each of those network interfaces on that virtual machine. And what we're doing with the NSX distributed firewall, we're not putting the firewall in the OS itself. We're running the distributed firewall in the hypervisor kernel. So actually, it doesn't sound like a big thing, but it's a pretty big thing. What that means is that if your operating system is compromised, the distributed firewall isn't in the same trust domain as the operating system. So therefore, you can still trust the security controls that you have in place. OK, so that's distributed enforcement. And when I get to this point with customer conversations, thinking, yeah, that sounds great, but, and inevitably there is a but, actually, how do I move to this model of micro-segmentation? I've defined my security policies for a long amount of time in my physical firewalls. I'm used to doing that. This concept of creating security policies between every virtual machine sounds like a big piece of work. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So actually getting NSX installed and deployed is relatively straightforward. So a couple of prerequisites. Hopefully, you all have vCenters. We need a vCenter for NSX. Hopefully, you all have ESXi deployed, some clusters configured. Again, we need ESXi. I'll caveat that. We support multiple hypervisors, but I'll come on to that in a moment. So we need ESXi. The sticking point for some customers is that they need the vSphere distributed switch. So I can see a few faces drop. Yeah, OK, so not everybody is running the distributed vSwitch. Now, important point, if you're not running it because of a licensing constraint, we'll give you the distributed vSwitch with NSX. So as part of buying NSX, you'll get access to the distributed vSwitch. So hopefully that's a tick in the box. So those are the prerequisites. In terms of actually getting NSX deployed, there's a couple of one-time tasks. The first of those is we have this concept of an NSX manager. So you have to deploy an NSX manager. It's an OVA, so you import that into vCenter, give it some basic configuration, it's up and running. Once you've done that, you then point it at the vCenter, give it the URL, give it some credentials to access the vCenter, and that's the NSX manager deployed. The next part is then what we call preparation, or preparing the hosts. And what we're doing here is we're deploying VIBs down to ESXi hosts. And the point at which you've done this is the point at which you have the distributed firewall deployed. So at this point, every virtual machine has a firewall running in front of it. Right? So principally, it's 2 steps, providing that you meet those prerequisites. Pretty straightforward. So where's the complexity? Well, the complexity is in the recurring tasks. And what we mean by a recurring task is actually getting your security policy deployed. And this is where I see the vast majority of customers spending the most amount of time. These 2 steps, pretty straightforward. But this is where the complexity comes. I want to address that. So VMware recognizes that for most customers is the hard bit. So what VMware did last year is we acquired an organization called Arkin. Joe mentioned something earlier on called Network Insight. So I've got a demo here that I'm going to try and narrate as we go through. It will probably go too quickly for me to narrate. So this is Network Insight. It has a load of capability, but I'm really going to be focusing on just this segment here, which is one of its use cases. It's got multiple use cases. Network Insight is an NSX monitoring tool. To do what I'm going to show you here, you don't actually need NSX running. So you could deploy Network Insight and start to collect this type of information here. But what it's doing is it's essentially looking at traffic flows within the virtualized environment. So here we can see an approximate traffic distribution. So we can see the amount of east-west traffic. So when you're protecting north-south, actually, in this particular environment, you would only be inspecting the minority of traffic. 17% of this traffic is going outside of the data center. Far more of it is east-west, which is what we're inspecting with NSX. We can see the most commonly used ports and services. And here we've got what I lovingly refer to as the donut. So the donut here is showing us the traffic flows between VLANs, or if you're using VXLAN and NSX network, it will show us the relationship between our VLANs. So here we've got a VLAN, and we can see the incoming, bidirectional, and outgoing traffic flows from this particular VLAN, which is great, but how does this help me define my policy? So here we can see the services used, and what we mean by services are the traffic flows between virtual machines on that VLAN. So between these prod mid-tier virtual machines on that prod mid-tier VLAN, we can see there's a lot of web traffic. We can then see the services accessed from outside of that VLAN. So what are these virtual machines accessing? Well, we can see some infrastructure services here, DNS, LDAP, some other stuff as well. We'll give you visibility into each individual traffic flow, because really one of the biggest concerns that customers have is as soon as traffic hits their vSphere estate, the virtualized environment, they lose all visibility. So this is really powerful stuff. But the bit that is relevant to deploying security policy is based on everything that we've observed here, each individual traffic flow. Network Insight then distills a very specific set of security policy that you should create based upon what's been observed. So we can see based upon what's been observed, Network Insight is recommending you should create 7 security policy. And we can export these security policies so they can be imported into NSX. And in theory, what you would then do is add an 8th policy to those 7 recommended policies, which is a deny all of everything else. So in theory, at that point, what you've then done is you've moved to a zero-trust security model. You are fully micro-segmented at that point. Couple of points that are important to mention. So there's no agents that you have to deploy in virtual machines. What we're using to give this insight is NetFlow or IPFix. To get this type of insight, you don't need to have NSX running. Okay, so you could deploy this before you have NSX running and start to do your analysis of how things are communicating within the data center. And one of the interesting things is Computer World could even deploy this as part of a pre-assessment, something that we call a virtual network assessment. So what you get as an output, you don't get all of this, but you get a report that gives you some insight into what does the traffic profile of my data center look like? How much of that is east-west versus north-south? What are the most commonly used ports? What are the most common sources and destinations? So if you're lacking this type of visibility, then network assessment could be something that's interesting to you. So I've spoken a little bit at this point as to why organizations are looking to deploy NSX. Predominantly, it's for security. Despite the other use cases, security seems to be the big driver for NSX. And I want to spend a couple of minutes now talking about actually where are we taking NSX. So NSX historically has been an on-premise solution, right? So we have support for vSphere and for KVM on-premise. We're doing some work to broaden that support across to bare metal, so potentially being able to create a network overlay or security policy for a bare metal workload. We're looking at what we're going to be doing with Microsoft. We were doing some work around Hyper-V. Potentially, it makes more sense to do the Azure stack for on-premise. So that's what we're doing within the on-premise data center. We have integration with Horizon, as I mentioned, so we can do micro-segmentation of virtual desktops. And we also integrate with AirWatch as well. So if you're providing virtual desktops or doing mobile device management, we can integrate NSX with both of those solutions. And when I talk about NSX on-premise, what I'm referring to here are virtual machines. So being able to secure, automate, and provide application continuity to virtual machines. But yeah, the world is changing. There's new types of endpoints. So we're doing some work around integrating NSX with Kubernetes, and we can do that today. In the future, we're going to announce an integration with Cloud Foundry. So if you don't just want a CAS, containers as a service, you want to run a platform as a service, but then do micro-segmentation of your PaaS or your containers, we'll be able to do that. And we're building some integration with Docker as well. So that's what we're doing from a container perspective. And we're also looking at extending NSX into the public cloud. And there's a couple of things that we're doing here. One of those things is running NSX as a service to integrate with public cloud native workloads. And we can do that soon with AWS. So if you're running EC2 instances in an AWS VPC, we can do micro-segmentation of those workloads We can extend Network Insight into AWS and give you that visibility of traffic flow within AWS. And then we're also running NSX as part of the VMware Cloud on AWS. So if you want a vSphere stack in an AWS data center, NSX is part of that stack. And we're going to be broadening that across NSX as a service across Azure and the Google Compute Engine as well. But we support the VMware vCloud Air network partner ecosystem and also SoftLayer today. So if you want to run NSX within one of those environments, you absolutely can. And also back to Joe's point around the edge and edge computing, absolutely NSX is going to be part of that strategy. So whilst for a long amount of time, NSX has been a solution for virtual machines on vSphere or KVM on-premise, actually the future and the vision for NSX is a networking and security platform for heterogeneous endpoints, whether it's a virtual machine, whether it's a container, whether it's public cloud, and for heterogeneous endpoints, whether it's vSphere, KVM, whether it's bare metal, or whether, again, it's a public cloud. So that is the overarching vision for NSX, and we can do some of this today, we can do this today, we can do some of that today, and some of this today. So it's a bit of a mishmash between what we can do today and what is the future. So that was it. That was a quick snapshot of NSX. As I said, if you don't want to ask any questions now, feel free to grab me throughout the day. I'm going to be hanging around all day. Thank you.